Hi, everyone. Welcome to tonight's info session. We're going to get started in 1 minute. So I'll just give you guys some time to settle in and I'll start in 1 minute. Okay, so I think in the interest of time, it's almost 6:05. I will get going. Um, so welcome to tonight's info section about our new updated Parks Bylaw. My name is Anna Melnick, and I am the manager of our communications and engagement team here at the City of Penticton. I'm just going to take a few moments to set the stage for our presentation today and lay out some ground rules. But before I start, I want to respectfully acknowledge that we are gathered on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Syilx Okanagan people, and we are grateful to live, work, and play on these lands, and we recognize the deep and enduring connection to the Syilx people have to this beautiful place. So here are your hosts. We have myself, the communications manager. Kristen Dixon, our general manager of infrastructure and deputy city manager, is here as well. Julie Check, our general manager of public safety and partnerships, is here tonight. And Katja Irwin and Andrea Rendell are two of my communications advisors, and they are going to be the ones masters behind the scene, making sure that everything runs smoothly tonight. Our agenda is going to be to give a brief overview of what is in this overview or in session tonight. We're going to have a presentation from Kristen and Julie, and then we're going to move over into a question and answer period. Thank you to everyone who provided questions in advance. We are going to take the time to answer the questions we've received first, and then leave time for any questions that may have arisen during the presentation or that you've come here tonight with. And lastly, we'll finish off by touching on next steps as this process is ongoing as we review the implementation of this updated bylaw. And just before I turn it over to our presenters, I'd just like to go over a few housekeeping items. This presentation is being recorded and it will be posted on our website for future reference. If you have questions, please type them in the Q&A box. You might see two boxes that say chat and Q&A. Please make sure you're using the Q&A so we can take note of them and answer those questions. If we can't answer your question tonight, we will reach out and get the answer after the session, and we will post the answer on our website. Our intention is to answer as many questions as possible that are relevant to today's discussion. Please keep your questions respectful and concise, and we will not tolerate any discrimination, threatening, or aggressive behavior within the comments. And with that, I think we're ready to go. So I'm going to pass it over to Julie and Kristen, and thank you so much for being here tonight, and I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Anna, and I'll just wait for Andrea to take us to the next slide. Perfect. So good evening. I'm happy to be here tonight with Ms. Check to present some of the highlights of our new Parks Bylaw that modernizes Penticton's regulations of parks and public spaces for the benefit of all users. Next slide, please. Penticton's Park Regulation Bylaw number 3133, the previous Parks Bylaw, was originally enacted in 1974 and regulates the use of public spaces such as parks, beaches, and boulevards within the city. The purpose of the bylaw is to ensure the city's parks and public spaces can be used by all members of the public, ensuring their safe, enjoyable, and orderly operation. The previous bylaw was out of date, no longer reflected the needs of the community, nor aligned with evolving legal precedents set through case law in regards to temporary overnight sheltering. It also overlapped and in some cases contradicted some of the city's other bylaws. Given the extent of the changes necessary to modernize the bylaw, a new bylaw has been drafted instead of proposing a significant number of amendments. Next slide, please. The new bylaw retains many of the regulatory provisions from the previous version, including park hours, which are now standardized, measures to protect parks and trails, and has been updated to cross-reference other associated bylaws to remove and avoid duplication where possible. Additionally, the new bylaw expands on previously uncovered areas, such as the inclusion of trails, and outlines activities that are and are not permissible in parks. It also regulates the permitting process for special events. Furthermore, it offers more detailed and specific guidelines on vessels, as well as fires and the use of barbecues and other cooking devices in parks. The new bylaw maintains the prohibition on recreational camping in city parks and public spaces. However, Section 8 has been added to specifically regulate temporary overnight sheltering. And I'll turn it over to Ms. Check to discuss this section in more detail.
Thank you for that, Ms. Dixon. Penticton's previous bylaw, specifically sections 3 to 5, as you can see on the slide here, regulated camping and the use of camping equipment on public beaches and parks during specific hours. What I'll note is that recreational camping still remains prohibited in all of our parks and public spaces. And the provisions that I'll walk you through over the next couple slides are really focused on temporary overnight sheltering. As you can see on the slide, section 4 in the previous bylaw banned temporary overnight sheltering everywhere. However, the legal landscape has changed considerably since these regulations were enacted in the 1970s. And most notably, since 2008, there have been a number of decisions from the BC courts pertaining to outdoor sheltering in public spaces. These decisions are rooted in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, specifically Section 7, which states that everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of person. The BC courts have determined that in the absence of access to indoor overnight shelter space, a municipality cannot prohibit a person from erecting a shelter to protect themselves from the elements without infringing on that person's right to life and security of person. The practical effect of this is that in communities where the demand for emergency shelter spaces exceeds the supply of these spaces, as it does here in Penticton, an outright ban everywhere on sheltering in parks is unconstitutional and unenforceable. In acknowledgement of the current state of the law, bylaw officers have not been enforcing the old blanket prohibition against overnight sheltering in parks that was outlined in our last bylaw. This discrepancy between what was stated in bylaw and the case law rulings created a lot of confusion and conflict in the community, as residents would often call the department and reference this unenforceable bylaw, as well as the visible no camping signage within the city's parks. To manage public spaces both effectively and legally, the city has drafted this new bylaw to reflect our new current legal framework. A jurisdictional review was completed by the Bylaw Services Department to determine what other communities were doing to manage temporary overnight sheltering and to identify best practices regarding the use of public spaces and lawful ways to do this. And in this review, 3 main approaches were identified. The first approach is to allow it in all parks and public spaces with certain limitations. The second approach is to allow overnight sheltering only in 1 or 2 specified parks or public spaces. In effect, this is an encampment site, and to prohibit it everywhere else. Or the third option, which is to prohibit overnight sheltering only in certain parks and allow it everywhere else with rules. Of course, each of these options will have its own pros and cons, and what I'd like to acknowledge is that none solve the root cause of homelessness, but rather what they aim to do is better manage temporary overnight sheltering in a lawful way. We have recommended and council has adopted option 3 for Penticton, as it will allow the city to regulate temporary outdoor sheltering in a manner that balances the city's responsibility for stewardship of parks and trails, and to regulate parks and trails in a manner that's consistent with the purposes of these public assets, and also balance that with individual rights under the Charter of Rights and Freedom, including the rights of freedom of assembly, freedom of expression, and security of person. Engagements with 100 More Homes and the Lived Experience Group, which is a collective of social serving agencies here in Penticton, have found that what outreach workers and the unhoused are looking for from the city is better clarity around the rules and the enforcement. And the approach that we've proposed balances all of these considerations. As noted in each of the options, another key change that will supplement this approach is the introduction of specific limitations or rules, which previously didn't exist. As I noted, as the bylaw was previously deemed unlawful or unconstitutional, what this in effect meant was that overnight sheltering was essentially allowed in all parks and public spaces. And what we've tried to do through this approach is to balance it and take an approach that would allow for some designation of where it can't be done, and adding new rules to balance the use of spaces for everybody to enjoy. And with that, I will turn it over to Ms. Dixon to walk through the areas of the bylaw that prohibits temporary overnight sheltering.
Thank you. So under the new bylaw, temporary overnight sheltering is prohibited at the two main lake areas, including the following parks: Okanagan Beach, SS Sick Moose Park, and the Rose Garden, Rotary Park, Gyro Park, and Okanagan Lake Park, Japanese Garden, Marina Way Park, and Marina Way Beach, the northern section of Lackawanna Park, located at 886 Lakeshore Drive West, and on the other end of town, Skaha Lake Beach, Sudbury Beach, and Skaha Lake Park. These are heavily used tourist and community areas, are easy to communicate, and staff believe this approach will be less resource intensive for bylaw to manage.
So as Ms. Dixon noted, in the new bylaw, Section 8 includes specific regulations or rules, and these are brand new. They didn't exist in the old bylaw. The new bylaw sets time limits for temporary overnight sheltering and establishes where it can and cannot occur with a certain distance of playgrounds, fields, environmentally or culturally sensitive areas, or otherwise sensitive areas. The bylaw also specifies setbacks and space requirements to mitigate the impact on areas and the neighboring property owners. It's important to note that the proposed rules and restrictions apply to overnight sheltering and do not impact an unhoused person's right to use a park or a public space during the day, as long as the use is consistent with permissible park use. I'd also like to underscore that these rules only apply to municipal parks and public spaces, and the Fairview encampment falls outside of the scope as it's on provincial land. Next slide, please. I also want to take a moment to just step back and frame out this change in context of a number of initiatives that are currently underway within the city. As previously noted, this Parks Bylaw is an important management strategy to mitigate the effects of homelessness in Penticton, but it's not the solution. There are a number of other initiatives, as outlined on the slide, that the city continues to advocate for in an effort to drive towards the real solutions, which are housing. The city and the Penticton Indian Band are currently actively working with the province to secure Heart and Hearth resources for Penticton. And what Heart and Hearth is, it's a provincial initiative to support communities with encampments that includes coordinated outreach services and new shelter and transitional housing spaces to provide individuals with options for exiting homelessness. Staff are anticipating positive developments on this initiative shortly. Council has also approved the temporary winter shelter with an additional 40 beds to stay open for another year. And this has also made a great impact on the number of individuals needing to use parks for overnight sheltering, or reduced the need for parks for overnight sheltering. In addition, there's several housing initiatives that are in the planning and development stages, including the provincial Skaha assembly site, which is a provincial project, which will bring over 600 new units to Penticton, 3 city-owned sites for social housing, and a downtown Indigenous-focused affordable housing project. We also recognize that regional and provincial collaboration is needed for equitable service across all communities so that people can remain in their home communities for support. Council has provided SILGA with a motion for stronger regional responses to homelessness, and there's ongoing discussions about regionalization of 100 more homes in support of a similar purpose. Over the past couple of years, the city has also advocated for complex care housing and secure care for individuals with brain injuries, mental illnesses, and severe addictions. And the city continues discussions with regional partners and will monitor provincial progress on this front. Staff are also working on bringing forward the social housing and infrastructure plan, which will be brought to council at the next meeting, which essentially links social housing needs with operators, funders, and locations. This plan, alongside 100 more homes, is critical for dealing with the root cause of homelessness. While the bylaw is not the solution, it's a management tool while all of these long-term housing strategies materialize here in Penticton. Before diving into the Q&A and answering some of the questions, I wanted to share some information on our website that will assist in responding to many of the questions that we've received to date. One question that we frequently get is who to contact for different types of concerns. This information is under the See Something, Say Something on our website, and it summarizes which concern should be directed to bylaw and which should be directed to the RCMP. We also have created a handout, both for the social sector and for the public, that summarizes all the bylaw provisions that we noted in our presentation. And there's more resources on our website at penticton.ca/homelessness, including a variety of FAQs that have been asked over the last couple of weeks when we introduced this bylaw, resources, reports, and any news, media news releases that the city puts out as it relates to Heart and Hearth, or any of the initiatives that I've spoken to throughout this presentation. So with that, Anna, I'm not sure how you'd like me to proceed with the questions, but there's a series of questions that were submitted ahead of time that I'm happy to take a crack at to kick us off, and then we'll turn it over to you in the chat if there's any additional information that we haven't shared with you that we can answer for you tonight. So the first question is, how will the city enforce these rules every day? Will someone patrol the parks? The answer is yes. Bylaw Services is the predominant law enforcement agency that will enforce these rules. However, our CMP officers and the fire chief can also enforce the provisions of this bylaw. The bylaw officers are on site 7 days a week between 6 a.m. and 10 p.m. at night. And if there's any concerns from the public that a public space is not being utilized within its permissible use, or if you see items that need to be cleaned up or discarded, you can contact the Bylaw Services Department. The number, I'm not sure if it's on any of these slides here, but the number is 250-490-2240. And there's also opportunities for you to report issues directly online. The second question is here, what are the demographics of the people who are sheltering outside? So what I can share with respect to this is that every week by law for the last 6 months have been tracking the number of individuals that have been sheltering outdoors within city limits, and they've also been counting the structures at the Fairview encampment. As I noted, they don't have lawful authority to enforce rules at that encampment, but they have been keeping track of it. And what I can share is that as of last Wednesday, there's been approximately 60 individuals that have been sheltering outdoors, both within the Fairview encampment and within city limits. And approximately 30 of the individuals are on a given basis at that Fairview encampment. So in terms of the deeper demographics, bylaw doesn't specifically collect that level of detail when they're doing their weekly counts. But we did track some of those demographics at the temporary winter shelter, which I referenced earlier in the presentation. What I can share with respect to the individuals at that shelter is that approximately 28% were Indigenous, 57% identified as non-Indigenous, 60% were identifying as male. The average age of the individuals who used the temporary winter shelter were in their early 40s, and about 35% of the individuals had experiences of foster care in their childhood and early adolescence. The other thing I'll note is that the province every 2 years does provincial point in time counts, and this occurred in Penticton sometime in April, and we are expecting to have the full results of the PIC count provincially later this summer or in the early fall. And when that happens, we will be sharing that publicly and with council, and really sharing a deeper analysis and understanding of of the individuals who are sheltering outdoors. The third question here is, have you considered challenging the court rulings that allow sheltering in parks? So the simple answer to that is that when a bylaw is in conflict with a higher law, like case law, the higher law applies. And courts have ruled, as I noted, that a ban everywhere is unlawful in the absence of adequate shelter spaces being available. That said, courts have given municipalities flexibility of the approach that they'd like to take as it relates to overnight sheltering. And the approach that we've adopted in Penticton is one that is now balanced in light of these court rulings. We will continue to monitor the impacts of this new bylaw and its application here in our community. And at this time, we've not considered challenging the courts in their rulings for how municipalities can regulate temporary overnight sheltering. Is there anything to prevent a person from staying in the park with their tent down and belonging spread out? The answer to that, I believe I provided in the earlier slide. Unhoused individuals enjoy the same rights as any of us to enjoy public spaces. And as long as their belongings are packed up, light and tight, they are allowed to be in public spaces and in parks. As I noted, bylaw officers are out there every single day, patrolling all of the parks in our public spaces and beginning their wake-up calls of the unhoused at 6 a.m. to let them know that they must be packed up by 9 a.m. And requesting that they move along for the day. That said, individuals have a right to use parks and public spaces, and as long as it's done so in a respectful way that is in accordance with permissible park use, they are allowed to be there. Kristen, is there anything on these slides that you'd like to add to? I feel like I'm hearing myself talk a lot, and would any other nuance?
I think you've summarized those answers well, Julie.
Okay, I'll keep going. Next slide, please. What is the city doing to reduce crime in these areas? So public safety remains council's #1 priority, and our CMP bylaw and fire department have a number of initiatives that aim to reduce and address crime in all areas of the city, inclusive of our parks and public spaces. So the first thing I'll say is that we do have casual staff or additional seasonal policing officers that are hired during peak times like summers to meet demands for service. Bylaw and our CMP have also been working quite closely together over the last year and are actively sharing appropriate intelligence on hotspots or locations through crime statistics and calls for service data, and are proactively deploying officers or resources in the areas where our data shows that additional resources are needed. As an example, in the last quarter alone, Bylaw performed over 5,000 proactive patrols throughout our commonly known hotspots, and the RCMP similarly dedicated over 330 hours. We've also partnered over the last year with the Chamber of Commerce and the DPBIA to expand the camera program. And these cameras will be deployed in areas of the community that have a known high property crime as per our CMP data. And this was done to really support some of our businesses in areas that tend to have higher property crime vandalism than normal. Another key resource that is really making a big difference to reduce crime and the calls for service is the RCMP newly implemented since January 2024, the Integrated Crisis Response Team, which pairs RCMP officers with nurses to respond to mental health calls. And they've had over 300 interactions in the last quarter alone. And what we're hearing from our RCMP partners is that this initiative, that's interior health funded nurses with RCMP, is proactively and significantly reducing the calls for service to police. Next question here. Will the new rules include the Esplanade trails? So a portion, maybe actually I will turn this one to Kristen. This one's a perfect one for Kristen.
I thought you might do that, Julie. So a portion of the Esplanade is a prohibited area under the bylaw, as it is a riparian area, so a sensitive environmental area. And temporary overnight sheltering is prohibited directly on trails as well. So, however, the entire park is not a prohibited area. So there is some that are and are not acceptable. As noted, the city has created a 2-page handout which clearly outlines where temporary overnight sheltering is not permitted. And bylaw staff and the social sector partners will work to ensure this information is communicated clearly with those seeking shelter. And then the next question probably to you, Julie, around what about the Vagrancy Act? Can we use this to charge them and imprison them to get clean?
I think, have you answered the map one where it is allowed? Sorry, did I blank on that?
Sorry, what I said is that the 2-page handout does show where it is not allowed, and it explicitly notes the specifics of the distances and whatnot from those various areas, and that we would be working with the social sector and in our interactions with bylaw officers to ensure that people seeking temporary shelter are following these rules.
Awesome. I'll take a stab at the next one, the Vagrancy Act. Can we use this act to charge them and imprison them to get clean? As far as I know, the Vagrancy Act no longer exists in Canada. Vagrancy was removed from the criminal code in 2019. However, there are various provinces and municipalities that have their own laws addressing behaviors such as loitering and soliciting for money in public spaces. In Penticton, we have the Safe Public Places bylaw. However, this bylaw does not have the authority to imprison or force treatment. In British Columbia, involuntary treatment is governed by the Mental Health Act, and this act allows for involuntary admission of and treatment of individuals who are deemed to be a danger to themselves or to others, or who are at risk of a significant mental or physical deterioration without treatment. Recently, what we do know and we are monitoring is that the provincial government has announced plans to expand involuntary care for those with mental health and addiction issues. However, the details of this and how it will unfold aren't clear yet, and City Council and staff continue to monitor provincial advancements in this area. And when they do come into fruition, we expect and would hope that clearer regulations around authorities and who has authority to deal with these types of individuals will also be clearly outlined. What's happening with the encampment and what else is the city doing to reduce homelessness? So I think this one I addressed in an earlier slide, but I'm happy to just give an overview of it again. There's a number of issues or actions that the city's taking, and we're working very actively with the Penticton Indian Band and with our partners of 100 More Homes to look at what the long-term solutions for the encampment are. That said, on June 5th, Minister Callon was in Penticton, and he did make commitments to address that encampment and to start to flow resources to Penticton to address our homelessness issue. That said, the encampment does lie on provincial land, and we are watching for leadership from our provincial partners in addressing how a resolution of that will look. We have been advocating for Heart and Hearth, which will come with significant resources in Penticton to manage the issue with what's obviously and currently missing in a large way, which is housing, transitional housing. And as I noted earlier, with the extension of the temporary winter shelter, this has also made a significant impact. This time last year, I was reflecting with one of our officers prior to this call. We were estimating anywhere from 100 to 150 people sheltering outdoors through the summer. And at our last count, as I noted, we have about 60 individuals sheltering outdoors in Penticton. We know these numbers tend to increase as the summer months go on and the temperatures increase, but I think there's been a number of initiatives that the city has invested in over the last year that are starting to pay dividends in terms of seeing the impact of that in our public spaces. So that concludes the submitted questions. Anna, would you like me to start attempting some of the ones in the chat here?
Yeah, I'm happy to read some of them out for you if you'd like. And then you can decide between you and Ms. Dixon who wants to answer. So the first one is, I have been told by bylaw officers that they cannot stay for more than one night in a row in the same park. Is this true?
Short answer, yes. There are provisions within the bylaw that limit an individual's ability to stay within the same 100 meters of a park. So yes, the answer is there are some provisions in our bylaw that restrict the use of the same space by the same individual.
Okay. Then I have another question. What is your plan for managing individuals who park carts outside the park areas so they keep within the structural limit space and ensuring compliance with structural limits within the parks?
Thank you for that question. I'm not sure if you can skip to the visual. The visual had exact space. So one of the new restrictions or limitations guidelines for overnight sheltering does look at the amount of space that an individual can occupy. We didn't go so specific to outline the number of shopping carts that an individual can possess, but there are restrictions around the surface area that can be occupied. And Andrea, please correct me if I'm wrong. That surface area is 9 square meters. So as long as an individual can fit and manage their belongings within 9 square meters, they are within compliance of this bylaw.
All right. Another question is, how are these regulations enforced after 10 p.m.? Who enforces these regulations after 10 p.m. when they break the rules? RCMP doesn't enforce bylaws.
As I noted, the Bylaw Services Department is currently operational from 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. and RCMP officers do have authority to enforce on these bylaws after 10 p.m. Our Superintendent McCandy, who is in charge of the RCMP, has communicated these bylaw changes to officers. That said, enforcement of these rules will be by the RCMP are entirely dependent on their resources and ability to do so.
Sorry, I was muted. Another question is there a way to get a bylaw passed that homeless encampments cannot be near seniors living or where seniors may be at risk?
Do you want to take this one, Kristen?
I think in reading the additional explanation on the question, for example, blocking sidewalks and putting population in jeopardy, the bylaw does already prohibit, as does our current traffic bylaw, blocking of any sidewalks or trails or pathways more broadly. So you're not allowed to temporary overnight shelter in a way that blocks the regular passage of pedestrians or whatnot. We have not seen yet, I don't believe, Julie, in any of our research of other jurisdictions where there has been setbacks or distances from certain demographics of housing. However, we have already adopted some of that in terms of playgrounds, play structures, and schools and whatnot. So I presume it is a possibility that we could explore that if and when that, as we get some experience with this new bylaw. So I think that's something we can certainly take away for feedback in the future.
Right. Okay. I have an additional question. How many, oh, sorry, it moved when you moved it over. How many additional bylaw officers have you hired to enforce this new bylaw? Exact numbers, please. The bylaw officers are already overworked with existing complaints.
So we haven't hired additional bylaw officers. Our complement remains the same. What we have done is hired seasonal relief officer or casual members. And that roster can really range on at any given time. We have up to 10 individual up to 10 individual relief officers that we can draw on. We have given direction to our bylaw services department to monitor the impacts of this change and to call in seasonal relief so that our officers aren't being burnt out or overwhelmed with the provisions of this new bylaw. What I will also say is that our social sector partners have been on side in supporting the development of these rules and guidelines and are also supporting us with the education component, particularly with those who are living unhoused, to ensure that we're really all communicating the same consistent message to everybody. And what we have shared, I'm not sure if we noted earlier in the presentation, there is a period of implementation that will inevitably be a little clumsy, and we are asking for patience as the public becomes familiar with this approach. Our officers become more and more accustomed to some of the trends, and we are open to feedback from these information sections. We are taking away the themes and evaluating and monitoring so that any future amendments that do need to be made can be reflected with public input.
Okay. I have another question. Coming from the Lower Mainland, who will be on the hook for the cleanup of the Fairview encampment, and when will we see it cleaned up? As it grows, I'm worried we, the taxpayers, will foot the bill similar to Vancouver.
So the province will 100% foot the bill for the cleanup of the encampment on their land.
Thank you.
This is not something that the municipality will be paying for. It's occurred on provincial land. And as I noted earlier, the province has made commitments through the Minister of Housing as early as June 5th that this will get dealt with. And we anticipate that there will be more information that the province will share shortly.
Thanks, Julie. Another question is overnight temporary sheltering permitted in the park beside the senior center?
I can take this one. So thank you. The Robinson Park has not been specifically a prohibited location. However, there is a school in close proximity, so the setbacks from the school property lines apply. And there are also sports fields, which are the pickleball courts. So there are setbacks designated from that as well. So there are a series of setback provisions that significantly limit any opportunities for temporary sheltering in that specific location.
Right. Sorry, I'm just trying to find. I have a question. I'm not sure if we have numbers, but what is the city budget for bylaw nurses, RCMP, and firefighter staff as it pertains to dealing with these 60 to 150 people over the summer?
That's a really good question, and I don't have that specific number offhand. What I can say is that last summer staff did downloading a provincial responsibilities analysis, financial analysis, to calculate the costs, I believe, over the last 5 years of some of the issues that relate to overnight sheltering, mental health, and addictions. And at that time, again, I think it was July 2024, those costs were in the range of $4 million quantified of costs that the municipalities were paying as a result of the province not managing housing, mental health, and addictions. The question that you're asking is a little bit more specific, and we'd have to go back and get the exact figures on the salary costs for bylaw nurses and RCMP on a yearly basis.
Thanks. We have another question: is why are bylaw RCMP officers not seizing the carts from the homeless, since the stuff in it is stolen? That is the perception. That is the question.
I think there's a difference between perception and reality. If something is stolen, it requires an investigative process. And if an individual is experiencing a crime, they are encouraged to report that crime to the RCMP. We as a practice do not seize belongings on somebody's persons. The RCMP have a very specific process for how they do that, and under what circumstances. That said, if property, shopping carts with materials in it are abandoned and left somewhere within the city limits, our bylaw officers typically do issue notices and ask and try to identify the individual that the property belongs to within a reasonable time. If they're not able to, then those materials that are abandoned are taken and sorted for valuables, and anything that is valuable within that is returned to the RCMP, with the remainder of the belongings being disposed of at city yards.
Thanks, Julie. I think I'll point the next one to Kristen, because it's about signage. Will the city post signs in parks, allowed or not, stating overnight sheltering is or not allowed in that park?
Thank you, Anne. And yes, we are working on an updated signage plan. So currently we do already have signs that say no camping in parks. At the specific parks where temporary sheltering is also not permitted, those signs will be getting updated to be explicit that no temporary sheltering is permitted either. So yes, there will be some signage updates. It just may take us some time, as Julie said, to get that fully operational and implemented.
Awesome, thanks. And I just wanted to go back to the cart question really quickly, Julie, just to specify about the carts, because they are now not at the businesses where they were originally. Are they picked up and returned to businesses, or are they taken and given back?
Yeah, so the process, Anna, is that anything that is abandoned, like I noted, is sorted through for valuables that are given to the RCMP, and the carts themselves are returned to city yards. And I believe there's a process, Kristen, you might know better, where businesses are encouraged to come to the city yards and pick up any of the branded carts that belong to their business.
Correct. And Julie, just to elaborate on that one as well, we did bring forward some options to City Council quite a while back with a direction to bring forward some amendments, I believe, to the business license bylaw to strengthen the provisions around shopping carts in terms of the requirement to label them and whatnot, so that we could help prevent them from being stolen in the first place with some of the locking devices and whatnot that are available, even though those wouldn't necessarily be required, but encourage businesses to make use of them. But if they are in fact retrieved and delivered back to the yard, we would have the ability to reconnect them with businesses before they're disposed of. And I believe there may even be the possibility of having a fee associated with that, so that will further encourage the businesses to invest in some of those capital improvements to make the carts more difficult to steal.
Thank you, Kristen. I'm going to ask a question about how we determine the distances within our new meters. So for example, 15 meters from playgrounds, 4 meters from trails, and 50 meters from trail properties.
So Julie, maybe I can start with that one. So primarily, the distances that we landed on are rooted from our jurisdictional review in terms of what other municipalities are doing. We also did take a look at specific to Penticton. Do those distances make sense as it pertains to other bylaws? So we do have some other guidelines related to locations of sheltering. We have some, I think there's other guidelines around like the alcohol and parks projects and whatnot. So we did take a comprehensive look around other types of buffering distances that we do have. And again, align those with what we saw in our jurisdictional scan to try and find reasonable setbacks from those amenities.
Okay, thank you. And we have a couple questions about what the penalty is for breaking these bylaws or being in contravention of these bylaws. I don't know if one of you, Julie, maybe you want to speak to that?
Yeah, maybe Kristen, do you want to start with the broad enforcement and penalties for the bylaw broadly, and then I can speak to more the Section 8 component?
Sure. So like all of our bylaws, there was a corresponding municipal ticketing bylaw and bylaw notice enforcement bylaw that was passed at the same time as the new Parks bylaw that does have standard ticketing provisions for things like, having an open fire when you're not supposed to and things of that nature. So the bylaw department does have tools to deal with regulatory infractions under that bylaw. However, Julie, I'll turn it over to you to be more specific on the sheltering.
Thank you. So the gold standard, I think, acknowledged both in the courts and generally as a practice is that the best way to gain voluntary compliance is through a rapport with the unhoused. And that is something that we are strongly encouraging our bylaw officers to do. In fact, many of them know these individuals by name, know their backstory, know their history. We did not apply ticketing provisions to Section 8 of the bylaw, knowing that unhoused individuals do not have an ability to pay fines. That said, there is an escalating process of enforcement with this new bylaw, inclusive of the sheltering provisions. If our officers are requesting voluntary compliance and that's not sought, as I noted earlier, we are working very closely in partnership with our RCMP members. And last summer as well, one of the practices was that in individual or in scenarios or cases where officers were not able to seek or obtain voluntary compliance, that was further encouraged with an escalation of police presence and a police request. And of course, any behaviors that would then cross over into criminal code offenses could be met through an enforcement action by our RCMP officers. So that's the enforcement realm for Section 8 of the specific bylaw.
Okay. And I have another clarifying question. So from the information provided tonight, are we to understand that the only time camping in our public parks is allowed is if the shelters are full?
That is correct. A municipality can ban overnight sheltering in parks if it has provision for sufficient and accessible shelter spaces. As I noted, there are about 60 individuals currently right now that are sheltering outdoors, and our shelters are consistently at capacity. We have the 40 beds at the temporary winter shelter and about 70 beds at the permanent shelter at Compass. So as you can see, one of the reasons we're pushing hard for Heart and Hearth is to continue to increase the supply of the housing so that it reduces the pressure on our public parks and public spaces. That said, homelessness is a very complicated, complex social challenge. And while it's aspirational to want to get to the stage where it can be an all-out ban, there's so many individual factors that impact the reality of individuals sheltering outdoors. And the municipality is focusing right now on really leaning in on the long-term solutions for that. And as I noted multiple times through this presentation, this bylaw is simply a management tool, not the solution.
Thanks, Julie. I just have a couple more. So when a person does violate this the space rule, I suppose, and won't move their property, what happens to those possessions? Do you take the possessions, I guess is what the question is.
I'm trying to think about how to reframe an answer that's different to the one I've already provided. As I noted, if an individual is using the space within its permissible use, if they're in a public space, they are allowed to be there along with their possessions. Kristen, did you want to take a stab?
No, I was just going to say, I think the question is if they're not following the rules, Julie, so they're not staying in the 9 square meters, or if their stuff exceeds outside of that. And I think the answer you referenced earlier around the bylaw officers working to achieve compliance with the individuals would be our primary option. The question is what do we do if we don't get voluntary compliance within following those rules?
Yeah.
Okay, well, I'll give another minute or two to see if there's any further questions. Okay. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions pop in, so I suppose we could move on to the close of this presentation. Oh, we did have one. Well, this one question is, are there seniors living on the street and are they housed right away?
I'm going to try to do justice to this question because I know that our social sector partners, if there's any listening to me, I hope I'm not oversimplifying this process. Yes, there are seniors living on the street. There are youth living on the street. These are two growing demographics that we are seeing in some of the PIT counts provincially across the board, not just in Penticton. And unfortunately, as I said, the supply is so low in Penticton, and the social sector does the best that they can to work through a very systematic, coordinated access process to match individuals who are on the street with the appropriate housing. And a lot of the opportunity to move into housing is determined by that supply ability and whether it exists at that given time. So there are situations where there are seniors who are sheltering in their cars or sheltering outdoors, and they may not have immediate access to housing simply because they're seniors. And that is something that we're live to and continue to advocate for through many of the housing initiatives that we're really pushing progress on that were shared earlier today.
Okay, I have one last question here. As a follow-up, if it is deemed that the shelters are not full, will the bylaw officers move campers on that night?
As I noted, the shelters are consistently full. There might be one or two shelter beds open at any given time. And our officers are aware at times when those vacancies do become available. But it's ultimately within that individual's ability to make a decision whether or not they will or will not go into a shelter. And bylaw officers cannot force individuals to go into shelters.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I don't see any other questions that have come in, so I think we can wrap there. Just wondering if you two could just take us through sort of what happens now, next steps with regards to this bylaw.
Sure. So maybe I can start with that, Julie. So as both Julie and I noted, there are some things that we are still working on to implement some of these changes, such as the posting of signage, getting these handouts in the hands of our social sector partners and whatnot. So we have been continuing to update information on the website, which again, we would encourage everyone, if you have any outstanding questions, to attend and have a look at through those frequently asked questions. But essentially now we'll be working with our staff to operationalize these changes and seeing how it goes over the next little while. We have this session tonight. We'll be doing engagement as well with the public safety committee, the council's advisory committee. Sorry, I'm having a brain lapse there, as well as the Parks and Recreation Advisory Committee. So we've got a couple of engagements to do with those two advisory groups. And then we'll be taking all of that back and assessing how it's going through the summer and bringing forward any changes if we feel they are necessary once we complete all of that and the bylaws are fully operationalized. And I'm not sure, Julie, if you want to add anything to that.
No, I think you captured the majority of it. We're also working with our social sector partners, our outreach staff, to really understand the impact of these changes. And they're supporting us, as I noted, with the educational components of these new changes. And we will be leaning onto the experiences of our bylaw officers, our social sector, and through key informative sessions like tonight to really shape out how this bylaw is working and if further amendments are needed.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for taking the time tonight, and thanks for everyone for attending. We're going to leave it there, and I hope you all have a wonderful evening.
And maybe before people sign off, just a reminder of the bylaw department is available to take your calls for service. You can report issues online. I was just reminded that I noted the wrong phone number for bylaw services, so I'll just replay that. It's 250-490-2440. And if you have any other additional questions or feedback, please also feel free to email us.